Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to go through the 2019 ACJC Prelim Essay Question 2a. So let's start by reading the question. Explain what determines whether a firm should exit the market in the face of strong competition from other firms. I'd like to start by breaking down the question in C's. So in the first C, the command word, that is explain. We are here not to evaluate, we're just basically explaining the cause and effect in this question. So it's a usual 10-mark question. The concept here, right, we can see is whether a firm should exit the market. So what concepts would come to mind when you read this phrase, a firm exiting the market? When we think of a firm exiting the market, it is deciding against its objectives of profit maximization, right? If it's not maximizing its profit, then it must be minimizing its loss. So in the loss minimization theory, they will have to consider two things, right? The shutdown condition, which is the main concept that should be elaborated in this essay, or are there other factors that you can think of in terms of how revenue would continue to increase in the future, or anything that could talk about why their cost decreases in future, right? So a firm only decides to exit the market when it's making a subnormal profit. So in this case, their zone is about minimizing their losses. And if we look at the context, right, it is in the face of strong competition from other firms. So what would that mean? So we can unpack this phrase more so that we have clarity. So strong competition from other firms could mean a few things, right? Number one, it could mean a large number of firms in this market. We also know that it could mean there are increasing number of firms. But how does that impact this market? Could be two things, right? Strong competition could come in the form of price, pushing prices down as they are competing. Right? So, or we could also say that the demand is now more price elastic as there are more and more substitutes in this market. So should a firm exit the market? What is the shutdown condition? And are there other factors that could cause it to stay or exit? So let's look at the writing of our answer in terms of the A-level exam, right? It will always be good to start with an introduction. Okay, the point of the introduction is to frame the answer, and it's also to show the examiner that you that you understand the question, right? So that would require you to unpack a few things. Firstly, you need to understand what the objective of the firm is. So show the examiner that you know that usually a firm wants to maximize profits. However, in this case, we know that it's deciding to shut down or not, right? So in this case, the firm is trying to minimize losses, right? Because we assume that it is making subnormal profits. That's why they need to make this decision. So by showing the objective of the firm, you are also showing the examiner that you know that the firm is considering this because the premise is that they are making subnormal profits and deciding to exit. We should also then unpack what it means by strong competition of other firms. And how this particular firm is impacted. Why is that important in the intro? That's because this is the context which is given to us. So if we link it to how we unpack it here just now, right, it shows the examiner that you know what is happening in this question, you know the background and the reasons why this question needs to be asked. So you can give an overview of your shutdown condition and the direction of your question. So in this question, it's all about how much of its total cost can firm cover, right? Because this is about the shutdown condition, which is your main concept. But we also know that firms need to think of how might the situation change. Are there other factors that could cause it to stay or exit besides just the fact whether they can cover their total cost or not, right? So there could be other factors that you will think of, and I will discuss that later in this video. So then we can move on to our first paragraph, right? And a good thing to start in our first paragraph is the main concept which is being tested, right? The shutdown condition. And we know that the shutdown condition considers one main thing, right? What is the average revenue relative to the average variable cost? So I wonder whether you remember the shutdown condition, but if you don't, I think you need to read up in your lecture notes. If not, I'm going to go through as we are answering this question. Right, so to make a decision whether to exit the market, firstly, the firm needs to consider their decisions in the short run. They also need to consider their decisions in the long run. And with average revenue relative to average variable cost, there could be only two different types of scenarios. One, where the average revenue can cover the average variable cost or is more than the average variable cost. So how is that different in the short run versus the long run? Or the other scenario, right, could be that the average revenue is less than the average variable cost. So now we need to consider two scenarios in the short run and the long run, and whether average revenue can cover the average variable cost or not. So let's look at the total losses in each scenario. So if my average revenue can cover my average variable cost here, what are my total losses? My total loss, right? So average revenue more than average variable cost, I can cover my variable cost. So my loss is not my variable cost, right? And part of the revenue that is left, besides covering variable costs, can be used to cover my fixed costs. So in that case, my total loss is part of my fixed cost, right? Let me repeat that, because if my revenue can cover my variable costs, right, I don't need to consider variable costs as my loss, right? And whatever is remaining in my revenue after covering variable costs, I can use that to cover my fixed costs. So in that case, my total loss is part of fixed costs. What about the second scenario where average revenue is less than the average variable cost? So we can work out the math again, right? If I cannot even cover part of my variable cost, then my total losses here would be part of variable costs, and because there's not enough revenue to even cover the variable costs, right, I have to cover all of my fixed costs. So if we compare the decisions in the short run in scenario 1 versus scenario 2, right, which has a greater loss, right? We know that in this case, it has a greater loss. So in this case, they should exit the market. Whereas in the first case, they should remain. Right? So if you are writing the answer to this essay, you will be able to show and explain this shutdown condition in the short run in two different scenarios, right? Because that is what determines whether a firm should exit the market. What determines it is whether the AR can cover the average variable cost. And you will use at least one example to illustrate how that works out in the shutdown condition. Okay? But the shutdown condition also looks at the decision in the long run, right? And how is the long run different from the short run? If you remember, the long run, all costs are variable, right? There are no more fixed costs. So in this case, if all costs are variable, then here I am making at least a normal profit. Okay, so there are total loss is 0, right? However, if my revenue is less than my variable cost, which is my total cost, then my total loss is part of variable cost. So in this case, as long as my average revenue is more than my average variable cost in the long run, we know that this firm should remain, right? So in this first paragraph, right, you are asked the question, what determines whether a firm should exit the market? So what determines that is the average revenue versus the average variable cost, because that is the shutdown condition, and we need to consider that decision in the short run and the long run. So write it in a way where it's clear for the examiner using examples of different scenarios. Then we can move on to our next paragraph, right? Our next paragraph will then be considering what are other factors that could increase profitability in the future, right? Because if there are other factors, even though I fulfill the shutdown condition, I might want to hold on a bit longer. What examples can you think of, right? Perhaps you can think of the future growth of the market. Right, maybe competition is stiff now, maybe you cannot compete with the other firms and you're making a loss. But what if you know that in the future there will be a lot of people going to take up this goods or service that you are selling? Maybe this industry is still at its infancy stage, and there are a lot of new people discovering that they are demanding for this kind of service, right? One example I can think of is the ride-hailing technology, right? In the past, when Grab first started or Uber just started, right, the customer base was very small, right, and it was easy to be in a loss-making situation, right? But what if you knew that there is future growth of the market, right? You would know that in the future there could be increasing revenue due to growing interest, right? And this is for infant industries. So if that is the case, even though you fulfill the shutdown conditions in the short run, you might want to hold on a bit longer, right? Because you expect that revenue will soon outweigh your total cost. And that could be a good consideration as well, right? Or you can also think of a scenario, right, where there are closure of other firms because of the stiff competition. Right? What if other firms had decided to close down first, right? Even though you're making a loss, right? Maybe there are other firms who are in a worse financial situation compared to your firm, right? And if they exit first, you will be able to capture a larger market share, right? Increasing your revenue. However, this is dependent on the financial situation relative to other firms, right? Because if they exit first, then we know our revenue may grow in the future and we might not be making a loss. So we need not decide to exit the market. So I think that sums up the question. When we look at this question, it's not so complicated after all, right? The two things that the firm can think about when deciding to exit the market is number one, is the average revenue more or less than the average variable cost? And that's our shutdown condition, right? We also know that there are other factors that may increase revenue in the long run, right? And there could be many other reasons that you can think of. So in summary, right? What determines the firm whether it should shut down, right? In the short run is whether AR is more than AVC or less. Okay. In summary, it also says that in the long run, it's about whether firm is making subnormal profits. Because if it is making a subnormal profits, we surely know that it's better to shut down where its loss is zero. And lastly, okay, in summary, other factors that may increase revenue in future would be one that is good to consider as well for the other firm. So of course, this question is mainly about the shutdown condition. So I will start my explanation in this A-level question will be talking first more about the shutdown condition, and then my second factor, perhaps I'll just give one of the two that I have discussed, or another one that you could have thought of. So that is the end of question 2A, and I hope you learned something new and it's a good revision for you. Thank you.